Hello, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. We have an exciting program before us. I've been conducting research on education in Latin America for the past few years and met a lot of people working in that space. And I'll have to say, we've assembled here today what I would consider the dream team to talk to us about education in Latin America and the challenges post-pandemic. I'll introduce each of these panelists, all three of them together, and then each of them will talk for about 10 minutes. At the end of that, we'll have a period of question and answer. So during these talks, you can submit questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll pull those together to ask our panelists. Priscila Cruz, our first speaker, is the executive president of Todos pela Educação, All for Education in Brazil. She is one of the co-founders some 15 years ago of this organization. And I've long been an admirer of Priscila and the work that Todos pela Educação is doing to promote inclusive and quality education in Brazil. I've also had the privilege of organizing several conferences co-hosted by MIT and Todos pela Educação, one of which, the last, was unfortunately canceled, but I hope there's time post-pandemic to organize more. Second speaker is Silvia Schmelkes, who is currently the Vice Chancellor at Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico. She has had a long and distinguished career both in academia and in public service. And in the public sector, she was last the first president of INE, the National Institute for Education Evaluation. Our third speaker is Paula Lozano, who has graduate degrees from both Harvard and Stanford, and had a long and productive academic career in Brazil before moving to Chile, where she is currently the Dean of the Education School at the Universidad Diego Portales. Again, you can start submitting questions anytime in the Q&A. I'll now turn the floor over to Priscila.
Hello, Ben. Good evening to everyone. So thank you, Ben, for the introduction, for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here especially to learn with Paula and Silvia. And with the questions, I think we don't know the answers. Like, we are far from knowing all the answers that we need right now. We have much more questions. I think we've been learning a lot during this 1.5 years during the pandemic. So I hope I can cooperate with the reflection that we have to do right now. I think we can be very right and do the right things and maybe build a renaissance, or we can go down. And especially in Latin America, that has been lacking education for decades. And so I really hope that we can move faster, learn faster. And I think the best way to learn faster and move faster is to learn with each other. So thanks, Ben, for organizing this meeting. So I'm going to share just a short presentation just to help guide the conversation here. So let me put it. I hope you can all see the presentation. I think you can. So the question was, what is the education after the pandemic? So first, and I'm gonna say, I'm gonna present from the experience in Brazil, and I have to thank a lot Paula Lozano that is sharing this panel with me, because we've learned a lot with her and other specialists. So this is something that, as Ben knows, Todos pela Educação is a coalition So what I want to present here is something that this coalition of specialists, of public managers, of people that is trying to figure it out how to get out of the situation that we are now in Brazil. So I'm going to present some ideas for you guys. So first, how we were in Brazil before pandemics. So the first idea is we were improving. It's not true that Brazil was stuck, or that public education was stuck in time and we were not improving. That's not true. Sometimes here in Brazil there is this perception that public education is a disaster, nothing happens, and this is not true. So in the last 10 years, I think in the last 15 years, Brazil is improving. I'm going to give you just one figure. We in 2007, 28% of all students in primary school, 28% of all students was learning Portuguese, language. 10 years later, so in 2017, it was 60%. So 28% to 60% in 10 years. So the improvement was huge. And this is it's a consequence of good policy, good investments, and good implementation. So it's not true that we were stuck. The thing is, 60% is not 100%. And the improvements that we were having before pandemics was in primary schools, not in other in the other stages of basic education. So we were improving the beginning of this trajectory, but not in the whole basic education system. So this is one thing. The other is, so it was slow, like to move everyone. It was slow, it was unequal. So I have two examples here. I think these are the best examples in Brazil. Ceará, so two states, Ceará in primary school and Pernambuco in high school. So two different stages of basic education. We had Ceará improving a lot. So this graph in the left is Ceará is highlighted. So Ceará left. IDEB is it's an index that reveals the quality of education in Brazil. It's an index from 0 to 10. So Ceará left in 2005 with an index, with an IDEB of 2.8, and then in 2017, 6.1. So it's a huge, it's a huge improvement. It's the state that had the biggest improvement in this period of time. But you can see other states didn't improve this much. So it's very unequal and geographically very heterogeneous. The other graph in the right is high school. You can see high school didn't improve as much as primary school in Brazil. And the state that improved most was Pernambuco. Pernambuco was very clear in their public policy, so they were able to improve the results. So from 2.7 to 4. So in this scale from 0 to 10, 2.7 to 4. 4 is not good, of course. So we are saying we have to improve a lot. But Pernambuco in the last years had a great deal of improvement. So we have some examples, and we were improving, but not for everyone. The majority was being left behind. So I think this is the main characteristic of Brazilian education. we improve, but we improve for some students, not for all students. So we have to universalize quality instead of, I think we've universalized access, but not quality. So that's the main goal. And that was the main goal before pandemics. The thing is, now we have the pandemic. We have 1.5 years, and Brazil has this awful record of being the country that had schools fully closed for most of the time, for more time. For more time. So we have 1.5 years. So with schools fully closed. Some states, and it's not a coincidence, Pernambuco, for example, that I've just mentioned, Pernambuco that before had a good system, is the state that had less time with schools closed. São Paulo, the state that I live, and is the richest state in Brazil. Same thing. Some schools reopened, then had to close again, but they had a very active remote learning, but still many months with schools closed. Like in Brazil, in general, schools are still closed. So students are not having any kind of learning, and remote learning was not efficient. So it's not efficient anymore. It was in the beginning some states that were able to implement the remote learning, but now after 1.5 years, this system doesn't work anymore. So we really have to reopen schools, and that's been most of the work of Todos pela Educação. So we don't fully know what are the real effects. We don't fully understand yet what are the future effects of this period of schools closed, but we do know that Brazil is leading in number of months. Dropout rates has already and dramatically increased. 43% of youth already say that they don't want to go back to schools. So it's going to be really hard to have these young kids back to schools and in high schools. Remote learning had poor results. We don't have a lot of impact evaluations. São Paulo did one, a very good one, very well done evaluation. And what we've learned after a kind of well-implemented remote learning process here in São Paulo is that the learning is that students didn't learn much, very little, and we are going back to the same results that São Paulo had 1 decade, 10 years ago. So we are losing a lot of the progress that Brazil and São Paulo and other states are doing this assessment. But we are losing the recent progresses that we achieved here in Brazil. And the thing is that the COVID generation of students is paying the higher price in this pandemic. Everything is open here in Brazil. Bars are opened, commerce, shops, shopping centers are opened, but schools are closed. We did our choice. A very bad choice here is to reopen everything and to keep schools closed. That's a country's choice. So that's why we are working very, very hard, because the common sense is that we cannot reopen schools, too dangerous. But we know we have a lot of good examples in other countries and also here in Brazil, saying that it's possible to reopen with safety and to go back to the learning and the bond between students, teachers, school space. So we have to rebuild all this. And to finish this first talk, so what we need to do? So what is the future? And of course, we have a choice. We can choose not to do much, We can choose to keep schools closed. We can choose to not change anything and just go back when it's possible. We just reopen schools and, you know, we just deal with the situation as if it was business as usual. You know, we just go back doing everything that we used to do. What we propose at Todos pela Educação is that we have to take and embrace these two roads. We have a fast, a higher speed, shorter road, but it has to be very high speed road, is to mitigate the effects of this closure of schools in learning, dropout rates, and children and youth development, cognitive, social, emotional, and physical development, and get schools system back on the rails. So this is one thing. I'm not going to talk about this. There is a lot going on. Again, some are doing great, some are not doing at all. But we have to take this road, this shorter road, but this high-speed road. The other road is a longer, much longer road. It's a larger road, and that has the structural reforms that we have to implement here in Brazil. I'm gonna just mention some. So this larger road has to aim to universalize quality. We have already universalized access. We've lost a lot in the pandemics, but we have to have this agenda to universalize quality now. So this is the step that we have to make. This agenda has to combine, and that's what we propose, combines continuity of the public policies that is already working in Brazil. We have in Pernambuco, as I mentioned, we have in Ceará, as I mentioned, but we also have very good examples in Espírito Santo, Goiás, São Paulo, Mato Grosso do Sul. We have some experiences that we have to continue and disseminate to make them work for the whole country so that everyone can benefit from this public policy. So we don't need to import from Finland or Singapore. We already have in Brazil some of these policies that we have to spread in the whole territory. And an agenda of reforms. In this first part of continuity, we have high school reform that we still have to implement. We already started, we have to still implement. The Common Core implementation that is taking place and it's going on slowly now, but we have to speed up. The full-time schools, that is the model that explains Pernambuco's results. Also, the state municipalities cooperation system that we have in Ceará, that explains a lot of Ceará's results in literacy. So we have this public policies that we have to increase and make them stronger, and it's an agenda of continuity. But there is an agenda of reforms. I'm going to mention some of these reforms that we have to implement in Brazil. The early childhood development reform. We don't have a national policy for early childhood development. Understanding this policy as an educational, health, social assistance, culture, sports, public policies that integrates all these areas. We don't have this. Todos pela Educação has a proposal for this large scale for the whole territory of Brazil, because from 0 to 3, but 0 to 5 years old is the golden age. We have to have something to close the gap of this huge inequality that we have in Brazil. So this is one of the reforms that we have to implement. The other is teachers training and teachers career. And I think Paulo is going to talk about it. This is something that I've learned in Chile, actually, Paula, with you and some others. That is, we have to talk about professional development. It's not, it's one thing, it's professional development. And under this umbrella of teachers' professional development, we have attraction, we have training, we have career, we have conditions, we have many things. But there are two things in Brazil, two main policies that we have to implement and totally reform. Totally, we have to completely change, because the way it is in Brazil right now will never work. It's already not working. Actually, it's the opposite. It's harming very, very much the system. Is the teachers training, like in pedagogy and licenciatura. I don't know how to say this in English, but the teachers that will be in language, math, and etc. And teachers' career. Teachers' career bonding with students' results, teachers' development. How can we change? Because here in Brazil, it's just a matter of time. You progress in the career with time. That's it. So we have to work much better this career. We also have a proposal here at Todos pela Educação. For youth, vocational and technical education, only 11% of all high school students are in this modality. We need to have much more, 4 times more, especially now with the pandemics and with this dropout rates. Vocational and technical education can bring back this students, can give them a meaning for high school, for education again. And technological advancements. People say, you know, the pandemic helped the technological advancement. It did not, actually. It was just like the first step, the first page of everything that we have to do to really modernize, to really make schools 21st century schools. And not because Ben is here, but the other point that is really important, something that we knew before, but now we know it's determined, like it can determine if we are going to be successful or not. Stronger coalitions. It's not possible to go through these 2 roads, make reforms, implement reforms, and do everything that we have to do to recover education and also build another system, if we don't have much stronger coalitions. And that's another thing that we've been working on at Todos pela Educação. So that's now for now. I think that's the question. Again, I think I've been saying this since the beginning of the pandemic. It can be or not be an opportunity. We can build a renaissance, or we can deep dive into a dark age if we don't choose the right roads to go. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I'm very eager to listen to my other colleagues. Thank you, Ben, and thank you for everyone.
Thank you, Priscilla. Fascinating discussion. Let me turn right away to Sylvia, who has the floor now.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure being with you all. It was a pleasure listening to Priscilla, because I think the reality of Mexico and that of Brazil in education is very, very similar. Let me see if I can put this in presentation mode. Okay. So I'm not going to spend too long a time in the situation pre-pandemic. But of course, you know that Mexico is very, very unequal, and education in Mexico is unequally distributed. And what the pandemic has done is it has added new layers of inequality to this previously existing inequality in education, mainly through technology and economic difficulties that have been layers that have been added to inequality before. And the pandemic has actually exacerbated the previous inequalities, the previously existing inequalities. What we have here is a graph of learning results. And this is just an example. It's a 6th grade reading in the test that we applied in INE in 2015. And what we have here is a national average. There are 4 different levels that you can achieve in the test. And so the first level is the one in gray, is the one that indicates not reaching the basic standards for the grade, for the 6th grade or for primary education. So this is the national average, but here you have it by region at the level of marginalization of the region. And as you can see, the national average is 49.6. But when we go to the more marginalized regions, the ones that are below level 2 are 61.8. And the same thing happens when we take into account the resources of the family. This is a complex index that combines both access to goods and access to services. And again, these are the poorest and these are the richest. And you can see, the little ladder that is, it's like a ladder, no? And that is an example, an example of what our inequality is in learning, which is what really matters, because as in Brazil, access is almost solved, but learning is still a problem. So children are in school, but they are not necessarily learning, as you can see from these graphs. In Mexico, as in many other parts of the world, it is technology that has substituted face-to-face education. We have used the internet. In the case of Mexico, there's been a very, very strong use of television and also of radio, and the 3 versions of Aprende en Casa. In our case, we have also been shut down since the 20th of March, and we have not returned to school at all. No? So we also have probably a record the same as Brazil in this case. But it is precisely the groups that are in learning poverty that we have already mentioned that are the ones that have no access or little access to television and even radio. For example, there is a study carried out with those with PISA students, 15-year-olds, and we know that 53% of the 15-year-old students do not have a computer, or they do have a computer, but the differences between income quartiles are enormous. Only 13% of those belonging to the lowest income quartile owns a computer, and 78% of those in the highest income quartile in this same situation. This gap is the largest gap in all the Latin American countries that participate in PISA. So our inequality is enormous. There was a telephone survey that is a representative survey of the national population that was carried out in May in 2020, and it found that only 60% of the students were able to follow remote classes. So there are 40% that are not being engaged in remote classes through the internet or through television or through radio. And the economic situation, as you know, is very, very severe in general in Latin America. In our country, the estimation is that poverty has increased from 42% to 54% of the population. That means 14.6 million more people living in poverty. And of course, as we know, the impact of that on education is enormous. There's another survey that was carried out. This is not a representative survey, but it's a very large survey carried out at the end of last year. And this survey finds, among other things, that 28% of teachers had contact with 60% or less of their students. So what these data are telling us is that there are a lot of children that have been not in contact with their teachers or with any type of classes through technology. And also, Carlos Mancera did a study that which is a very small sample of 2,000 people, a little bit more. But what he finds is important differences between the regions of the country, such as Priscilla was presenting. For example, the percentage of teachers that are involved in distance teaching is only 64% in the south, in Chiapas and in Guerrero, while this is true of 95.5% in the center, in the state of Mexico and in Mexico City. And there are other very important regional differences. So what is happening is that learning deficit was already large, but it has been exacerbated and it is accumulating. Remote education, especially when it's carried out by non-interactive methods such as the television, what it does is to homogenize both content and rate of teaching, which are imposed on a very diverse and heterogeneous population. And the result is that many are excluded, even those who have access to technology, many are excluded from being able to follow the education process and obviously of achieving learning results. And this particularly affects the development of foundational skills, such as literacy and numeracy, which need a sequence and need someone to follow or to lead you, to guide you, to support you in your process, and a careful follow-up of each of the students. And as we know, foundational skills are basic for other learning results. These conditions lead to an expected increase in students dropping out of school, such as is happening in Brazil. A recent survey that was carried out by Mejoredu, which is the agency that took over INE, the INE functions, found that 5% of the students said they would not return to school, and 13% did not know if they would when schools will open. So in short, the educational crisis that has been brought about by the pandemic is reflected in large learning deficits, particularly in foundational skills, an increase in dropout rates, the emergence of new emotional problems that are affecting learning, and concerning deepening of educational inequality. So what are the ways forward? This webinar is called After the Pandemic, and we really don't know when after the pandemic will be. Right now, Mexico is in the middle of what seems to be a third wave of infections, and they are supposed to peak in August, and we are also supposed to open up schools in August. So we really don't know what is going to happen and when the after the pandemic is going to be. But nevertheless, whenever it is, we will still need very, very strict security measures. And this means less children in school and less hours of schooling because of social distancing. Water is a problem. At a national level, 5% of schools have no water for hand washing, but this is true of 25% of community schools which are in rural areas. And 48% of schools do not have running water every day of the week. So this is a problem for going back to school. Schools that don't have water, children cannot go back to schools that don't have water for hand washing. The pandemic has affected everyone, but as we have seen, it has affected some more than others, not with the same intensity. And we have basis for believing that this affectation will be a lasting affectation. It's even said that it can be generational. So what do we need? I think we need a new strategy for ensuring equity post-pandemic, but not only post-pandemic, from then on. They're not emergency measures. We need special attention to people and additional resources to be given to those regions and communities that had no contact with schooling or with teachers during the pandemic, and who are those who have always been in learning poverty. We also know that social emotional disturbances have grown during the pandemic, and they will have to be attended to. So we need to build school climates that emphasize respect, security, and warmth. And intercultural education, especially in a country like Mexico that has a large indigenous population, has to be extended beyond indigenous schools, because many people belonging to different cultures are attending mainstream schools and not only indigenous schools. And teachers should be trained in tending to a greater diversity of learning achievement in each of the groups of students, because differences in access to technology and also in family support during the pandemic are going to be reflected in these differences within the groups. So inclusive education has to become the norm. And for inclusive education to take place, I believe that it is on-site training of teachers what works best for changing teaching practice, not courses, and especially not remote courses. Also, I believe that streamlining the curriculum will be an imperative, and that foundational skills have to be prioritized. As we know, foundational skills work with content, but hopefully this content will be contextualized and attractive and significant to the students. So it will have to be diverse, heterogeneous, different for the different groups of students. Also, teachers and schools should be given greater autonomy for making organizational and pedagogical decisions, in order to respond to individual and contextual differences. We have found the advantages of technology and education, but we do need an adequate combination of technology and face-to-face education. But this should be developed by each school in view of the particular situation of their students. Nationwide, the right to internet has to be progressive, has to become a reality progressively. Educational assessment is also an issue. Of course, diagnostic assessment to map learning differences is a must, but I believe that for a considerable amount of time, a year at least, children and youngsters should not be assessed with consequences. That means with grades or with leaving children in the grade in which they are in. So I don't believe any child should be left behind in a school grade. Instead, accelerated learning strategies will urgently have to be developed. I think that something that we also learned with the pandemic is the importance of the relationship between the family and the teacher, and now between the families and the schools, and this should be maintained and strengthened. And we also need intersectoral policies that attend to the multifactorial causes that affect those that are going to leave school. And these have to be put in place because child labor has increased, and because economic problems are severe. We now have more population living in nutrition deficiency. So all of these things need multi or interfactorial strategies to be able to solve the problems. So in reading this list of the ways forward that I think we have to follow, it would seem that this strategy, these different actions that we have to take are not only emergency measures for facing the aftermath of the pandemic, but rather they reflect what many of us have always wanted for the educational system. That is an educational system that is equitable, inclusive, decentralized, warm and welcoming, centered on significant learning, a system that trusts its teachers and that supports them with the training that they need to achieve learning results in very diverse realities. So my conclusion is that we have to take advantage of this educational tragedy to profoundly transform our educational systems. And in that, I agree completely with Priscilla. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia, for a very ambitious agenda of reforms. Let's go straight to Paula. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank MISTI, the International Initiative of MIT, and its Chilean, Brazilian, and Mexican programs, who invited me to share my experience and my perspective of what have been through since the beginning of the pandemic and what is the next education in the context of Latin America. Also, I want to greet the panelists of the seminar, Ben Schneider, Priscilla, Sylvia Smelks. Given my research and my experience on teacher policies, I will focus my brief presentation on teacher education, specifically of the impact of the pandemic on the preparation of teachers in our region, but more specifically, because I'm in charge of a School of Education in Chile, I'll be talking about Chile. Looking at its present and future challenges, so I will zoom on the challenges of teacher preparation in times of COVID-19. So I will start by speaking about the moment we were on teacher policies before the pandemic started, and then I will move to the negative impact that I see in the short and in the long run, and finish up with a more positive outcome that should persist in teacher education after the crisis. So where were we in teacher education before the beginning of the pandemic in 2020? First, we were just starting to realize the central role that teachers play in the quality and equity of education, and the importance of having a good teacher in each and all of the classrooms in our countries. And thus, we were trying in our region to design and implement policies, like Priscilla talked about some of them, that would better attract candidates to teaching, that would improve teacher education, that would provide better working conditions to teachers, that would strengthen professional development for the teachers in service, that would increase salaries and the social status of this profession in Latin America. So in this scenario that we were living, pre-service preparation, teacher education plays a major role. Of course, that its impact in the new intake of teachers, it's big. It's not as big in the teachers that are already in the system. But by changing the pre-service teaching, we start ending up the supply of low quality entrants into the profession. So not targeting pre-service teaching is just like what we say in Brazil, try to dry like a big block of ice under the hot sun. It's just not gonna work, right? So what we saw in our region during the 90s and the early 2000s in terms of teacher education, and this is certainly the case of Brazil and Chile that I know the most, is a growth in private universities, many of them for-profit, in a very unregulated market of higher education. And those were offering low quality, sometimes night, distance programs to prepare teachers, in-service teachers. So this is so because we needed to prepare teachers fast to deal with the increase in enrollment in the education systems of countries in Latin America. Like Priscilla showed in Brazil, they became more inclusive, included more children. So what we saw was a huge increase in enrollment. We observe a huge increase in many countries of our region of low quality education programs. And different from other professions like doctors and lawyers who try to regulate the quality of those who should enter their profession and the institutions that can provide their specialized training, this is not the case with teachers, and especially in Latin America. So those who are worried about teacher quality, and Priscilla showed that in the agenda in Brazil, start pushing the debate to the need to make teaching a profession, increasing the control, increasing the regulation of the providers, the new entrants in the labor market, like medicine, like law, and having those professions, having a preparation with a specific body of knowledge, with a lot of clinical work, a lot of practice, a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience of the practitioners, having the practice in the center of the teacher preparation curriculum. So the push for the reform in teacher education in some countries, and this is the case of the reform in Chile in 2016, but that really started 20 years ago, emphasize a rigorous and intense curriculum of pre-service teaching with high national standards, regulating the provision of the service and increasing the importance of the partnerships of schools and universities in preparing new teachers, because we needed to gain the knowledge that comes from practice. Thus, the low quality, low intense, disconnected from practice types of programs had to shut down in Chile. So for example, in Chile, we had a decrease in the number of programs after the reform by 30%. That's not the case of Brazil. Those programs have grown since the early 2000s. And for example, today, more than half of the teachers in Brazil I prepared on those types of programs. Well, so we were in the middle of this shift, and at least in Chile, very concrete. In Brazil, like pushing the agenda, like Priscilla explained, waiting for other aspects of the policy to have an impact and attract more students to the teacher profession, and having more good quality programs when the pandemic hit us. I think one note in the transition from low to high quality teacher policies that we can learn from Chile is that it's much harder than the Chilean policymakers thought would be. Even with all the new requirements to study education, increase of salaries and of the new entrants in the career, it's definitely more a long-term policy than they imagine. And we can see that from international experience. So when we talk about the pandemic impacting teacher preparation, we have to understand that two major things happen at the same time. Universities had to go online as schools had to go online in the best scenario. Like Priscilla and Sylvia said, not all schools could do that. But good quality teacher education programs, when we look around the world, are not online. Good quality schools are not online. High quality teacher educators, they have developed our training and preparation experience in a face-to-face fashion. So the schools of education artifacts, their pedagogy to teach how to teach, they were not developed to be used online. At least not as much as we had to do all of a sudden. Also, our primary learning professional environment, that is the schools, where we have the mentor teachers, students interacting with each other, they were gone. I mean, or at least they changed the way they operate. They become virtual, online. And given that major change, the last thing this environment where we learn to be teachers, we're interested, especially in the first year of the pandemic, to deal with teacher education students trying to learn how to be a teacher. So different from Europe, where schools were open most of the time and teacher education students were used as a helping hand to deal with the problem of having small class size or less students or different formats in different spaces, given the restrictions of the pandemic, schools in Latin America were either closed or were offering online classes. On the top of all the limitations that Priscilla and Sylvia said about access to equipment, connectivity, technology, capacity of teachers, etc. So teacher education had to adapt in the best scenario to this virtual setting, both at the university level, like the classes, as well as the school level, like where we do our clinical work, where we do our practical. And in the second case, the schools, we had no control over them. So in Chile, and in the case of good quality programs in Brazil, that meant return to where we were before the reform. So we shifted teacher education from a full time intense, face-to-face, hands-on preparation inside the school to something more similar to what we had before. Given that, in my opinion, one of the downsides of the pandemic is not only a cohort of new teachers who will have had a less intense, like clinical curriculum, less interaction with the artifacts or good pedagogies used in high quality teacher education programs, like modeling a class, like rehearsing with your peers that we do in high quality programs, but we will maybe be losing ground in our policy debate towards the need of a more rigorous curriculum, since we had survived the pandemic mostly online after all. So why bother making the shift? So the fact that we had to do emergency education to keep preparing teachers, we'd never stop preparing teachers. It does not mean it's a long-term alternative, as if technology was like a panacea in the teacher preparation. And the high cost of good quality programs and this experience, successful experience, may undermine the need for a radical reform in teacher education, and we have to watch out for that. The second pitfall that we at least observed in Chile was a major drop in university applications to teacher programs in the country. We had to remember that Chile already had a decrease due to the strong regulations that they did to education programs. But in the last application period, not even those quality programs were able to fill the spots. And although there was a general decrease in university application, it was much worse in teacher education programs. Whereas, for example, on health-related fields, we observe an increase in applications. So many researchers and policymakers fear that the loss of interaction and the motivation that high school students are experiencing in school during the pandemic had an impact in their motivation to become teachers. Also, it was clear that the experience of being a teacher online is much more challenging and stressful when we compare to face-to-face experience, as many surveys with teachers have shown. So an already low status profession in our region has been severely impacted as a profession with this pandemic. So there is the advantage people would point out to be a teacher, despite the fact that it's low status, low paid job, related to the personal satisfaction of interacting with children, with youth, and make an impact on their lives. So the massive closing of schools in our region has contributed to the feeling of not being able to transform as much as we could before. Therefore, decreasing the idea that teaching is a profession that I should pursue. Therefore, what schools will become or what schools will do after the pandemic to compensate for the immense inequalities produced by this crisis presented by Sylvia and Priscilla will definitely impact teacher education, not only on its contents, pedagogy, but also because they have the challenge to attract the young generations to become teachers by showing teaching as a transformative and personal rewarding profession, as we used to see before the pandemic. Just to finish up, what have we learned that is positive, that I think it should persist after the pandemic? I think there were two sorts of positive impact. First one, in the way we work, we needed to increase coherence, we needed to increase the focus of all we do in preparing teachers. We need to change the way we evaluate the teacher preparation, making meaningful, authentic, because we had to avoid copy, for example, plagiarism. We had to rethink what we can do to have an exchange experience with teacher educators. And of course, we had to increase our capacity to use technologies in our institutions and within our faculty. But I think the most important learning experience that we have to carry on is the relationship that schools of education, universities have to have with schools, the ones we had during pandemic. Of course, once they were in their feet, we were obliged to adapt to each one of them and trying to help them in difficult times, because if we didn't help them, we would be able to send our students to their practical work. So that requires flexibility on our part, as also from our students, who end up having very different experience depending on the type of schools they were placed. The fact that technology was widespread within schools and its staff, at least, we could communicate better with schools and teachers to discuss the challenges of preparing new teachers together. So in terms of collaboration between university and schools, the relationships that lasted the pandemic are much more solid now and can give space to a much more strong teacher education curriculum, more tied to the real challenges of the school, as the practice teacher basic education approaches call for. So whether in the future teacher education will be able to profit or not from this intense experience, I think remains to be seen, like Priscilla and Sylvia concluded. I do hope teacher education in our region keep moving towards the right direction, and that the pandemic is not used as an excuse to lower the quality of our teacher preparation programs, but the contrary, we use this crisis to become stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo, for the very interesting and sobering view of teacher training. Thank you all. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so won't be able to ask questions of our participants, but we will post the recording of this as well as links to their websites. I would just like to say in closing that it seems, particularly when we're looking at the issue of inequality, that there's no substitute for sort of class time and school teacher-student contact. So I think it's going to be an enormous logistical issue of how to expand that time between teachers and students, particularly if we're facing a shortage of teachers going into this. So I would leave you with that thought about what are the ways that we could have students spend more time after school or other programs, larger classes potentially, which also has downside, mixed age classrooms. I think there could be a lot of ways to promote that contact, but it's going to be very difficult to figure it out logistically. I guess I would say, just as the note of optimism that I could take from these mostly pretty sobering accounts, is that everybody's agreed that you shouldn't let this pandemic go to waste. We have to take advantage of this crisis in order to try to improve the education systems throughout the region. So thank you all for attending. Thank you again, especially to our panelists. Please stay tuned. I'm sure there'll be more to discuss on these issues in the coming months.